Courtney, now going back to the Hegseth issue, it seems that Donald Trump may be having some second thoughts about Hegseth. Is DeSantis the only name on the list of potential replacements?
No, he's not, Jose. We're hearing about a couple of other possibles. I should say that ever since Donald Trump, frankly, even before he became the president-elect, we've been hearing about a whole long list of individuals who could be selected to be to lead up the Department of Defense. And this is no different. What is different this time, though, is this is the first time that we're hearing about real talk about the possibility of Pete Hegseth, who was selected to be Donald Trump's Pentagon Secretary of Defense, the first time that we're hearing some questioning of the possibility of his nomination actually making it all the way through to a confirmation. So you mentioned Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He has some military experience. He was a JAG, or an attorney in the military. And then, of course, he's been running the state of Florida as a governor. So he has experience running a government organization, institution. Also, we are hearing about Republican Senator from Iowa, Joni Ernst, also military experience. Of course, she's a senator, so she has experience in government. We're also hearing about a somewhat surprising name, and that is Florida Republican Congressman Mike Waltz. Now, of course, he was named to be the National Security Advisor for President-elect Donald Trump. So this would be a move before he actually really is even in the job of National Security Advisor to a new role. Mike Waltz, of course, served in the military and special forces, did combat deployments, and he has become very close to Donald Trump and to the Trump family in recent years. Now, in addition to that, we're also hearing another name that may be familiar from throughout all of this transition time, and that's Republican Senator from Tennessee, Bill Hagerty. He was a name that we heard during the possibility of who was going to run the State Department. He is another one. He has a little bit more diplomatic experience, having served in his position as an ambassador. But all those names are out there. Again, Jose, the reason that this is so notable today is that for the last several weeks, despite all of the concerns we've heard about Pete Hegseth and some of his policy decisions, and now these character concerns that have been coming out over the last 3 weeks or so, for the first time now, we are hearing real talk about people who could possibly replace him for the job, Jose.
And Courtney, I mean, I know you helped break the story of the current and former Fox News employees speaking out about Pete Hegseth's alleged drinking. How concerned are they?
Yeah, so this goes to one of those character concerns that we frankly have been hearing about now in multiple reports. But where ours is a little bit different here is this is talking, we spoke with, as you mentioned, 10 current and former Fox News employees who spoke about how his drinking impacted them while they were working with him. Now, these are individuals who said that he would show up for the popular weekend news program Fox and Friends, sometimes only minutes before the show was about to go on the air. And at times he would be clearly hungover, even talking about it. There were even several occasions where he came in still smelling of alcohol from the night before, talking about how he had been out late or not even being home at all. And this caused a lot of stress and pressure on the staff. As anyone knows who's worked on a show, when the host is not always reliable, it causes a lot of pressure and concern for the people who are working on that show. Now, I should point out, none of these individuals said that they can recall a time where he didn't show up for an appearance or he was actually notably, visibly drunk on the air. But they did say that this was something that caused a lot of concern behind the scenes. It was something that people talked about. And while we know about cases back to 2017, instances where this was occurring, we also spoke with individuals who said it was even in more recent years that there were still concerns about this happening while he was at Fox News, Jose.
Courtney Kube, thank you very much. Garrett, Hegseth responded to the allegations with a post on X this morning that reads in part, quote, "Our warriors never back down, and neither will I." He says he won't back down, but what are you hearing from Republican senators?
Well, look, Hegseth is full steam ahead. He's continuing with his meetings today. His mother, who was involved in one of these episodes, having sent an email that was then leaked to the New York Times about Hegseth's character, was on Fox News this morning defending him. We believe Hegseth himself may sit for an interview later today to defend himself more completely than he's done thus far. But there are questions among senators, including folks who have more sort of a pro-Trump bent. It's not just kind of the remaining more moderate, more traditional Republican senators who are concerned about Hegseth. And I think these meetings are going to be very important. Now, these lawmakers understand they don't want to have the wrath of Trump brought down on them by sticking their necks out and publicly saying they'd be a no vote, especially before Hegseth has gotten to a confirmation hearing or really had a chance to defend himself and have these meetings more completely. But there are sort of varying degrees of dug-in-ness here, from lawmakers who didn't like the Hegseth pick to begin with, to those who are becoming increasingly concerned by the drip, drip, drip of negative press coverage he's received more or less nonstop over the last week.
Yeah, I mean, and Garrett, there has been talk of maybe 2 or 3 Republican senators who, in general terms, could be seen to go one way or another on Trump's different choices, but it's more than 2 or 3.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, 2 or 3 is not necessarily a problem. Republicans are going to have a 3-seat majority in the Senate, which means they can afford 3 no votes, assuming every Democrat opposes a nominee, and still get their nominees confirmed with J.D. Vance breaking a tie. So it's only if you get more than 3 no votes that you find yourself really in trouble. When we were tracking the Matt Gaetz nomination to be for Attorney General, we were hearing about upwards of 6 potential no votes. That's kind of the ballpark where we are right now with Hegseth, although it's not clear that any of those no votes are as dug in as the opposition to Gaetz was. It's a fluid situation, and Hegseth is clearly being given some time by the Trump team to try to clean it up himself. But the clock very well may be ticking as Trump is continuing to announce other Pentagon posts, including a nominee for Secretary of the Army, which he selected just within the last 20 minutes.
Lance, what do you make of all this?
Well, I think if you are that concerned about Pete Hegseth, and he's up for one of the biggest jobs in the country, if you are that concerned, my issue with this story is no one's willing to go on the record and put their name out there. If you are that concerned about his drinking on the job and stuff, for gosh sakes, just put your name out there and tell us how you feel. Because now this morning, we have some of his co-hosts and people he worked with at Fox News saying on the record that none of this is true. And so that's the issue I have with stories like this, is it's just littered with anonymous sources. And then today we have people saying it's not true. And I think it does a disservice to not only Pete Hegseth, but to the voters and to everybody else out there trying to figure out what's going on. Now, having said that, he's going to go. He's doing what he needs to do. He's sitting in front of the Senate. He's answering these questions. I think it would be great if he did an interview. But again, I go back to these types of stories that just have anonymous sources are not helpful to the process, and especially when you see that his coworkers are coming out saying something completely opposite today.
Yeah, and Juanita, to his point, Pete Hegseth's mother went on Fox News this morning, and we were just talking about that. Here's part of what she said. Listen to this.
I want people to look at Pete, judge people, or understand him for who he is today, and to disregard the media. That was 7 years ago. And most of it is misinformation. Pete is a new person. He's redeemed, forgiven, changed.
Do you think Hegseth's nomination has reached a tipping point?
I think I appreciate what Garrett went to when he highlighted how the parallels of this track with the parallels of what we saw from Matt Gaetz, who went through those meetings on Capitol Hill and said everything was on track. The Trump transition team said everything was on track until it wasn't, until he got the call from Donald Trump to step down. I also think this is also going to depend on what comes next in terms of these stories. When I read the reports of the former employees, and when I read that email from Hegseth's own mother and see it compared to what she says today, I think people can look at that and say, okay, this is a mother trying to do what she can for her son, but her words were printed. I do think when it comes to Hegseth, he has to really be clear about where he stands with Donald Trump. And the fact that Donald Trump is considering, and it's being reported, who he's considering to replace him as the DOD nominee, that can't make him comfortable. That can't make him feel confident. And honestly, it seems as though Trump is bracing for another loss handed to him by Senate Republicans.
And Garrett, I mean, Hegseth's mother on Fox News today was very clear that she, repudiates that email that she sent him. Apparently, she sent another email shortly after that with a completely different perspective, but she certainly was just making the point that that email was a personal, private email to her son that she regretted almost immediately.
Yeah, look, Jose, I don't know anything about how that email ended up in the hands of the New York Times, but I'll say two things about the reporting on this generally. Number one, the Hegseth's mother, I guess, told the Times in that original reporting that she sent a second email repudiating the first and that she would provide that email to the Times. As best I'm aware, that email has never shown up. So what's in that second email, we're left to just wonder about the contents. And on our reporting, Courtney Cuby's reporting about Hegseth's time at Fox, I'll just say that that reporting was something that we at NBC News presented to Fox News and gave them 6 or 7 hours to respond to on the record if they were inclined to do so, to push back against any of those allegations that were in that piece yesterday. They chose not to. So what they're saying today is all well and good, but having had the opportunity to respond directly to the claims in that piece in time with the actual reporting, they chose to say nothing.
There is an ongoing and active manhunt here in New York City for a gunman who shot and killed Brian Thompson, CEO of United Healthcare, one of the nation's largest insurers, this morning outside of a very crowded, busy hotel in Midtown Manhattan. Now, we do have security footage of the incident. I'm going to show it to you, but we are, of course, going to freeze it right before the actual shooting occurs. At 6:46 a.m., Thompson, the man in the blue jacket you see, has walking near the New York Hilton Hotel when a gunman approached from behind and, as you see there, shot Thompson in the back. Gunman continued to fire, at one point his gun appearing to jam. The man cleared the jam and fired again. The shooter fled the scene, first on foot, then on bike, at least according to NYPD. Police later released these security camera photos, apparently shot in a nearby Starbucks before the shooting, showing part of the assailant's face obscured by the mask and hoodie. It's nearly 14 hours after the attack. There's much we still do not know. Earlier today, New York police held a press conference and called this a brazen targeted attack where the gunman waited for his intended target.
I want to be clear. At this time, every indication is that this was a premeditated, pre-planned, targeted attack.
The motive for this murder currently is unknown, but based on the evidence we have so far, it does appear that the victim was specifically targeted. But at this point, we do not know why. This does not appear to be a random act of violence.
Tom Winters, the NBC News national law enforcement and intelligence correspondent, and he joins me now. Tom, I got to say, my word, I mean, just in terms of where it happened, the audacity of it, the barbarity of it, and the fact that it happened in such a crowded spot of the city. It was 6:30 in the morning.
Yeah, you think 6:30 in the morning and who's going to be on the streets. But in that part of town, as you and I were just discussing in the break, it is busy at that hour of the morning. That's a very busy hotel, the Hilton Hotel, where he was apparently on his way to speak at a conference at 8 a.m. There's an awful lot of tourists that are in the area. This is a huge part of the Christmas season here in New York City. It's what's called a gridlock alert day, so people can't move around. Even at 7, 8 in the morning this morning, it was very difficult to drive around town. Points to one of the things that came up in the course of this, I think, that is rather important, the fact that he took a bike. That was the exact way to get out of this area at that hour, to be able to get at least somewhat of a head start on the police department. And so, frankly, got lucky, this alleged shooter, this suspect, that he didn't bump into an NYPD officer, just given how many officers are out there in Midtown when this happened. So, yes, this is somebody who clearly knew where this health executive was coming from, the hotel he was staying at, where he was going to, a general sense of what time that might occur. So it definitely points to some planning ahead of time. It was an e-bike that he had, but it was not a city bike, so not something that could be immediately tracked. And so I think there's a lot of questions tonight about where he's going to go.
Oh, that's interesting. You resolved one of the details, because I had seen there had been reporting that it was a city bike, and then Lyft, which runs the city bike program, said that it was not our bike. So it does appear to be an e-bike that he got away with. Now, I saw a number of eyewitnesses interviewed there. I mean, the scene must have been shocking there.
Oh, absolutely.
And a bunch of people who saw him lingering for a long time.
Right. So he was lingering for a long time. But as you see here in the video, I mean, he does it kind of in a perfect setup for him. He's got the camera to his back. He's got him in front of him, so there's no opportunity for Thompson to realize that he's behind him. This is a person who's married. He's got 2 children. So obviously a very difficult thing, Chris, for his family. And he's got what appears to be some sort of a suppressor on the gun, which may have led to it jamming, but that's going to obviously quiet the sound and not ricochet through the canyons of Manhattan at that hour. So definitely some planning here. He's wearing a mask. The images that we saw that were taken, that was from prior to the shooting, a little bit more clear tonight, but probably not enough face showing for the NYPD facial recognition unit to be able to do its work. And so, yes, at this hour, still some solid leads that are being followed, but I don't think the Detective Bureau has keyed in on exactly where this is going to go yet.
Maybe this is a dumb and naive question, but I'll ask it. I mean, I think my first reaction when I saw this had happened was like, there's no way this person can get away with this. Like in this day and age, with the insane amount of surveillance technology, digital footprints of everyone, the amount of cameras that are all over the city covering every inch, you can't shoot someone in the middle of Midtown and ride off on a bike. I mean, how confident, I guess, are the NYPD that they will find the suspect?
I think there's a strong feeling that at some point they will get to a resolution here that will result in handcuffs. And just knowing these days how they're able to do these investigations, how they're able to work backwards. I mean, the whole key to this investigation is going to be the timeline. And it's not just the moment of the shooting and the moments afterwards and where he goes to 55th Street, picks up this bike that he apparently has waiting there, zooms up 6th Avenue, goes into Central Park. That they've got. Now you want to start tracing backwards. Where was he? Does he make a mistake? Does he drop that mask at some point? All of those types of things come into play. To your point, I completely agree with you. I cannot remember the last high-profile crime in Midtown that was not solved, because not only do you have NYPD cameras, they're going to work with the hotels, they're going to work with the restaurants. They freely exchange that type of video. Nobody wants this in the heart of New York City. They're going to get that information and be able to back it up.
There was some reporting today, interviews with the widow for Mr. Thompson, saying that he had received threats. But as of now, earlier today, obviously, as you saw in the clip we played, there was no determination of a motive, and I imagine that remains the case until they have further identification of the suspect.
That's right. That's the chief of detectives speaking. There was a cell phone that was recovered. Unclear if that is specifically involving the suspect or if there's anything on there that could be helpful. In this day and age, if there was any sort of tracking of a cell phone, I mean, what they can do with the cell site analysis, both the NYPD and FBI, even if needed, is fairly incredible. So the information on that phone obviously could be helpful. Tracking back those threats. So if they're able to go back and say, what types of threats did he get? Could that point us in a direction? Again, Chris, all the type of work that you know that's going on. Yes, it does sound a little CSI to us here, sitting here and talking about it tonight, but it is the actual work that they're doing.
Yeah, imagine there's people working around the clock on this. Tom Winter, as always. Thank you.
You got it.
Senator Elizabeth Warren, the Democrat from Massachusetts and member of the Armed Services and Finance Committees. Senator Warren, thank you so much for being here tonight. What a strange chapter of American history we find ourselves living through. First, let me just ask you about the outreach that Pete Hegseth is doing on the Hill and elsewhere. He seems very focused on women. His mother seems very focused on female senators. Do you think any of it's working?
So let's look at his problems with women. We've seen the allegations of rape, the allegations of sexual assault, but there's also the question of what he has said about women serving in the military. Remember, he's been nominated to be the Secretary of Defense, which means the person over all of our military. 18% of active duty military right now are women. And without those women, we don't meet our recruiting targets. We don't have the ability to field an Army, a Navy, an Air Force, Marines. And what has he said? Those women should not be allowed. No women should be allowed to be in combat. And that's like saying, you know, here we are, we're going to run the military, and for men, it is a great deal. Come on in, do every job we've got here. Tell us what you like. We'll get you in there. We'll let you climb that ladder. We'll let you do whatever you want. Women, not really. You're going to be confined just to a different set of jobs and have no chance of ever meeting any of the top positions in the military because you won't have any combat experience. That is a problem. It's a problem for our military and ultimately for our national defense. Because if we can't have the talents of those tens of thousands of women who right now sign up and join the military voluntarily, we're going to lose them, and we're going to lose the next generation and the next generation, wave after wave. And that is a problem for our entire national defense. You can't have a Secretary of Defense that starts out saying to nearly 1/5 of the active duty military, you're not really welcome here as a full member. Good luck to you, but go somewhere else.
I believe, and the control room will correct me, Senator, that today Mr. Hegseth sort of reiterated his support for the work that women have done in the military, and that he believes they are, I'm paraphrasing here, strong fighters, but did not, to your point, go out and say, as Secretary of Defense, he would ensure they continue to have combat roles. I guess I wonder, I think what you're talking about is very significant. It's something that's been less covered in all of the controversies around Pete Hegseth. Do you see any through line between the allegations surrounding his behavior towards women and his treatment of women and his attitudes towards women in the fighting services?
So I think those two are very closely linked, and I'm glad you drew that connection. Because, again, I want to go back to all of the women we have in the military. We also have a problem right now, and have had for a long time in the military, with sexual assault, with sexual harassment in the military. 29,000 women filed active complaints last year for sexual assault in the military. And, look, everyone who studies this understands that is a way underreport of what's actually happening, because many women understand in the military, if you come forward and file that complaint, you can just kiss your career goodbye. And that many, many leaders have been far too protective of men and making sure that there aren't complaints against them that make it into their file. So we already have a problem. And it's a problem for recruiting women into the military. It is a problem for retaining women in the military. And now Donald Trump has nominated someone who has a long history and whose own mother has called him out as a harasser of women. And the problem with that is he can say, oh, I didn't do that one, and I didn't do that specific one, and now I got my mom to stand up and vouch for me. But the reality is, what woman says, I want to dedicate my career to defending my country as part of active duty military, when I know that the guy at the top who's going to set the tone for the entire military is somebody who himself is credibly accused of having been one of those guys on the front line who was one of the ones who was after women over and over and over, including in the workplace. And he's the guy who's supposed to be in charge and make this a military that is open to both men and the women we need in service. That's not going to work. And I say this by way of saying, whatever else you want to say about him, this is a problem for our national defense, and that means he is not unqualified to be the Secretary of Defense. He is disqualified to be the Secretary of Defense.
Do you think that line of argument and that reasoning and all this information that's coming out is resonating with the senators on the Hill that could very well decide his nomination? I'm thinking in particular of Joni Ernst, who he met with today, who's a woman, who's a senator, and said, I appreciate Pete Hegseth's service to our country, something we both share. Today, as part of the confirmation process, we had a frank and thorough conversation. Frank and thorough. Do you have a sense of where this is going on the Hill?
Look, I don't want to speak for any other senator, but I will say this. On the Senate Armed Services Committee, we have two women who have been in combat, Tammy Duckworth and Joni Ernst. We have a lot of men and women on both the Republican and Democratic side who work hard to try to make sure that this is a military that can actively recruit the best and the brightest men and women. I am the chair of the subcommittee on personnel. My ranking member, Senator Scott from Florida, a Republican, both of us hear the complaints, get the complaints, and work to try to make sure that our military is responsive. And the reason for that, I just keep trying to stress this, we're not meeting our recruiting targets Being in the military is tough. It is a tough job. And making that your career is a really hard decision. To say to effectively 1 out of every 5 people who feels that in their heart and that that's what they want to do, you're not welcome. To be a full participant just because you're a woman cuts them off from active duty military service. And that undermines our national security. That has got to be a concern to every single member of the Armed Services Committee. We are the ones who will hold the hearings on Hexeth and ultimately do the first round of voting.
There's a lot of concern about the future of the U.S. military, and including a concern shared by you and your colleague Richard Blumenthal about how and whether the president-elect may try and weaponize the U.S. military or direct it against U.S. citizens. And I know out of that concern, you have urged President Biden and the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin to issue a policy directive that prohibits the mobilization of active duty military or federalizing National Guard personnel to be deployed against their fellow Americans unless specifically authorized. The criticism here is that Trump could rip it up once he's president, but certainly he'd have to explain himself in doing so, and that in and of itself is something. Have you gotten a response from the president? Have you heard from the Secretary of Defense? Do you have any sense of whether this is of interest to them?
So we're still in talks. Let's just leave it there for right now. But you put your finger on it exactly. Right now, there's no prohibition. And that means the next president has very few curbs in this area other than law generally. And so what we want to do is get something very specific in place so that if he wants to make a move, Donald Trump is going to have to do it out in public in front of the whole country and explain himself for doing that. And sure, maybe he will do that, but it's not nothing to put curbs in place and force him to actually, if he wants to do something, to have to step up and explain why he is ripping those curbs up. So that's what we're pushing the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense to do right now. And we've got a lot of support for that in the Senate. We don't need to vote on it. It's not a legislative matter. It's a matter of trying to get the administration to move right now to make it very clear there are curbs on the president using the military or using any part of our defense industry against citizens of the United States.
Wow. I mean, we're in the zone of preemptive pardons against people who have not committed crimes and trying to curb the president from turning the military against American citizens. That is where we are at right now. These are the guardrails that people like yourself are trying to establish in the waning hours of President Biden's administration. Senator Elizabeth Warren, thank you so much for helping us understand the moment. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
We are, unbeknownst to most Americans, in a hot war with Russia, an undeclared war, a war you did not vote for and that most Americans don't want, but that is ongoing. And because of that war, because of the fact that the U.S. military is killing Russians in Russia right now, we are closer to nuclear war than at any time in history.
Fired Fox host Tucker Carlson has returned to Russia to interview Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. You remember the guy Donald Trump allegedly revealed classified information to the first time he was president, while in the White House with Russian but not U.S. media present in the room. The subject of the Tucker interview was the ongoing war in Ukraine. Recall that Carlson traveled there earlier this year, sitting down for a quite sycophantic interview with Vladimir Putin after touring and marveling at Moscow's far superior grocery stores. It was Putin's first interview with an American, quote, journalist since before his invasion of Ukraine. And by interview, we mean an exchange of anti-Ukrainian propaganda, distortion, and lies. Tucker isn't the only darling of Russian state TV that's making noise. Some of Putin's loudest mouthpieces are just giddy over the clown car that is Trump's proposed cabinet. Per reporting by Julia Davis of the Daily Beast, who monitors Russian state TV, host Vladimir Solovyov and host and head of RT Margarita Simonyan are rejoicing over Trump's picks, especially Kash Patel and Pete Hegseth, predicting, quote, they will quickly dismantle America brick by brick. Joining me now is Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia and an MSNBC international affairs analyst. Ambassador McFaul, thank you so much for being here. Your thoughts on the equivalent of, Russian 60 Minutes, the hosts therein giddy and laughing that Donald Trump's picks for his cabinet, particularly Kash Patel and Pete Hegseth, will dismantle America brick by brick.
Well, first, one qualification. It's the equivalent of their 60 Minutes, except as 60 Minutes controlled 100% by the Kremlin. So that when you hear from Solovyov and Margarita Simonyan, these are not just independent journalists giving their opinion. These are opinions closely coordinated with the Kremlin. And once said that, it's even worse, right? Because you're right. They're cheering on those people, that particularly the ones you just named, cabinet picks, are not so excited about some others. We'll get to that later. Maybe Senator Rubio, for instance, is not as popular, but they like these folks for one simple reason. Putin has a theory of the American deep state, and he thinks the American deep state is antithetical to Russian interests. And when he sees these people, he thinks they are going to weaken this so-called deep state. And, they've declared revolution against the state, right? And so if we're having a revolutionary fight within the U.S. government, within the Pentagon, within the FBI, within the intelligence community, who benefits from that? Vladimir Putin.
Right. And I can imagine that the idea of, whoever the defense secretary will be, we can presume they'll have the same agenda. They call it dismantling the quote-unquote woke agenda. By woke, they generally mean any minority, right? So LGBTQ people of color, they want to run them out. They want to, in Hegseth's case, take away the prohibitions on people with certain tattoos that have been, that the current administration has tried to get out of the military to reduce the amount of extremism. If they're fighting over that and not letting women get reproductive care, and those are the fights they're having, that helps the Kremlin, I'm assuming.
Exactly. You're talking about our warriors, right? I'm using that word on purpose. Our warriors that defend America, not just against Russia, but also China. If we're not equipping them to do their job in deterring an attack on the United States, shoring up our NATO allies so that we don't have to fight Vladimir Putin. It's incorrect what Tucker said, by the way, that we're in a war with Russia and close to nuclear war. That's completely hogwash. But our job, we want to defend America. That's what the warriors at the Pentagon want to do. And if we're declaring war against them, that benefits our adversaries. It's just straight up. It's black and white. If we're fighting them, they are not doing their job to protect the American people.
Let me read you a little bit more. Russian State TV, this is some more of this reporting. Evgeny Popov, the co-host of Russia's version of 60 Minutes, described Trump's picks as his radical dream team and gleefully noted all of them personally despise Zelensky. He cautiously added, they aren't friends of Russia except, for Tulsi Gabbard. One more thing. Julia Davis also reported that during Sunday's broadcast of State TV of the evening with Vladimir Solovyov, a program Putin watches regularly, host Vladimir Solovyov aired a clip of Kash Patel threatening to upend the FBI's operations. And Solovyov said, Trump's nominee to head the FBI, Kash Patel, is simply on fire. He's tremendously, really, really good. What do you think that they think they'll get out of somebody, like either of these two people, Kash Patel or any of them? What do they think that they'll do to their respective agencies, particularly Tulsi Gabbard?
Well, first, I hope Solovyov is wrong. I want to be clear about that. I hope that maybe they're giddy about things that might not happen here. But what they're hoping for is the destruction and the weakening of the intelligence community in the United States. What they're hoping for is the weakening of the FBI. These are agencies. They have a phrase for it in Russian, the siloviki. These are the strong ministries. These are the ministries that do the most to defend the United States against Russia. And if we weaken these kinds of agencies, the CIA, FBI, the Pentagon, that makes Russia better off. And so if Solovyov says you're a really great hire, that makes me nervous, because Solovyov, I know him. I used to know him. He is no friend of the United States. He is an enemy of the United States. He is paid by the Kremlin to propagate against American national interests.
And there's Tucker Carlson cheering it all on and cheering against Ukraine on Russian soil. You can't make this up. Ambassador Michael McFaul, thank you so much.
Joining me now, former Assistant District Attorney in the Manhattan DA's office and MSNBC legal analyst Catherine Christian and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. Welcome to both of you. So walk us through what the Trump team is asking, Lisa, and how they're using the pardon as part of it.
Well, let's start with what they're asking for, Chris, because they were at a point in time asking for the verdict in this case. That's the jury verdict that Trump was guilty on 34 felony counts. They were asking for that to be vacated, and now they're going further. They're saying that the indictment itself has to be fully and finally dismissed because of the norm that a sitting president can't be prosecuted. And that's an idea that they extend now to a president-elect. They essentially say that because a president-elect is consumed with ensuring the continuity of government, that the same constitutional concerns that prevent the prosecution of a sitting president should extend to Trump in this period as well, and therefore the entire case should be thrown out.
Do you think, though, Catherine, that the inclusion of the Hunter Biden pardon strengthens the Trump team argument?
No, they had to throw it in. It was sort of a gift that happened this weekend.
So more political than legal, in your view?
In fact, the whole brief, in my opinion, is legal arguments surrounded by scurrilous allegations against the prosecution team, against Jack Smith, against Judge Merchan, against his adult daughter who doesn't live with him. And it's really a political brief as opposed to a legal brief. I don't believe that Judge Merchan will be dismissing the indictment based on this. An indictment, by the way, that went to trial, and as Lisa said, a jury found the defendant, Trump, guilty of 34 counts.
So we mentioned D.A. Bragg, and he's previously signaled in his arguments that he thinks the case could be paused while Donald Trump is in office. But Trump's team in this filing, as you said, argue that that is not an option. How does that debate play into the judge's decision here?
Well, I think that debate plays in, Chris, coupled with statements that were made by the district attorney's office under a different leader, Cy Vance, when they were litigating their access to documents from the former president and future president in his personal capacity, some of his tax and financial documents. They conceded in a filing that a sitting president could not be prosecuted and that they would not intend to exert any prosecution against him. They were solely looking for documents. There's a concept called judicial estoppel. You say something in the same or related criminal proceeding, you're bound by that. And I think that is the best argument that Trump's lawyers have now. They should be and may be asked by Judge Merchan, why shouldn't that bind you here? If that's what you've already conceded, why are you asking me to pause this case rather than to dismiss it entirely?
The authors of this filing, Catherine, are Todd Blanche and Emil Bovee, two people who could end up actually at DOJ under Donald Trump. I don't even know what to say about that. Is that crazy? Does it impact this?
Well, it's interesting, and I was saying this to Lisa outside. They quote a very famous quote from Robert Jackson, who was a former U.S. Attorney General, former Supreme Court judge, where he says the most dangerous power of a prosecutor is that he will pick people who he thinks you should get rather than pick cases that should be prosecuted. I hope both Mr. Bovee and Mr. Blanche have that as screensavers if they should go to DOJ, because if they included it in this filing, I found ironic considering the statements that have been made, not by these two men, but by President-elect Trump about using the department to exact revenge against people.
So we already knew, Lisa, that Judge Juan Merchan had postponed sentencing on the 34 counts that we talked about indefinitely. What happens now?
He's going to decide whether or not to dismiss the case. The DA's brief is due on December 9th. There is not going to be a reply, and no party has asked for argument thus far. That means unless something changes, this is going to be in Juan Merchan's hand as of December 9th, and we should expect a decision to come shortly thereafter as to whether he dismisses it. If he decides he's not going to dismiss it, then he has to make the decision about whether or not to set aside the verdict. And if he doesn't set aside the verdict, what happens to sentencing? And does he, as the DA has signaled they want, stay the case for the duration of Trump's next presidency?
Merchan, and I think like all the judges who have been involved largely, at least largely, in the cases involving Donald Trump, have said that politics does not play into this, that their job is to fulfill the law. But how tough is this decision for him, do you think, Catherine?
It's very tough. We remember in September, Trump was supposed to be sentenced, but Judge Merchan citing that it might interfere with the election, and the consent of the DA's office adjourned it until after Election Day. So I'm sure it's very tough on him, and he's a human. Once again, having to read about his daughter in a filing and allegations against her. But he's a very good judge and will come up with the right decision.
Just have to remind you, don't you ever let anybody take your power from you. You have the same power that you did before November 5th. And you have the same purpose that you did. And you have the same ability to engage and inspire. So don't ever let anybody or any circumstance take your power from you.
That was Vice President Kamala Harris last week, sharing some optimism and strength with her supporters while addressing her loss to President-elect Donald Trump. Yet Trump's imminent return to the Oval Office has had a ripple effect in the professional world, particularly on women. Mental health experts say they're seeing many female patients disappointed with the election results who are going into the office with, quote, even high-functioning depression. Here to discuss, MSNBC contributor Huma Abedin, who is also vice chair of Forbes and Know Your Values 3050 Summit, and Forbes women editor Maggie McGrath. Maggie, your team's been reporting on this. I do understand it. For me, the impact on women's health has just been devastating. And in terms of dealing with moving forward, now it's about moving forward within this new reality and trying to see what can be done about these strict bans. And it's hard that we're taking such a step back to take a step forward. Talk more about your reporting on this dynamic at Forbes Women. What have you found?
You are absolutely right, Mika. We have, of course, the policies that affect women's health, like reproductive health, but this is about mental health. And what the American Psychological Association has found over the last many years is that elections stress people out. We know this. 70% of U.S. adults actually said this year that they were stressed by the presidential election. But what's really notable is that this stress and anxiety did not dissipate after the election results. And in particular, this is affecting women. Medical doctors who spoke with Forbes Women said that patients who are female and/or parents and/or part of the LGBTQ communities, in other words, people who could be most affected by the policies of the incoming administration, are appearing outwardly fine but internally struggling. What this means on a practical basis: they might be showing up at work, getting stuff done, but they could be procrastinating. They could be calling out sick a little bit more. They could be engaging with coworkers less and experiencing uncharacteristic feelings of irritability and detachment. Now, the popular term for this is, quote unquote, high functioning depression. But I would note that that's not a clinical diagnosis. You won't find it in the DSM-5. So if you've been feeling off, if you've been feeling hopeless, talk to a healthcare professional, talk to your doctor, talk to a counselor, because you really do want to ask for help if this persists for many weeks at a time.
Now, Huma, Democrats are having deja vu in a huge way, with noticeable similarities, of course, between then Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton, your boss, in 2016, and then the loss Kamala Harris just went through. What are you hearing from women on the mental health front or overall, and what are you telling them?
Well, we had the similarities in that we had two qualified women running to be commander-in-chief who did not end up in the Oval Office. I think the difference, the biggest difference I have seen and heard, I was actually at the Eleanor's Legacy event last night. This is an organization that supports pro-choice Democratic women running for office. And when I said the word the term high-functioning depression, women in the room nodded. And I think the difference and the reason I give that context is in 2016, there was shock People did not believe, especially the women who ended up not voting at all, would come up to me on the street, on subways, and saying, I don't understand how this is possible. There was this element of guilt. I should have done more. And I think in part it's because we had people who didn't take Donald Trump literally or seriously back in 2016. That has changed. I think the significant difference post, November this year, 2024, is women know what's about to come. I mean, just in the last few days, we heard about another woman in Texas who died because she was denied the medical care that she needed. And so it's the fear that is a big part of the change of and that is sort of leading to these conversations, certainly, that we're hearing from women saying they are girding themselves. There's the despair, right, because they know what's coming.
Right. No. And look, I think there'd be some on the right who would have a field day with this, saying, oh, my gosh, depression. Yes, actually, women are dying. Yes. Because they can't get health care that they desperately need because of these strict bans that were put in place after the fall of Roe, which Trump takes credit for. And this is the reality that they are living with now. That, I think, is worthy of being extremely concerned, if not depressed. And yet, I say we still fight and we still look for some sort of middle ground in all of this and deal with the reality, the hand that we've been dealt. And fight forward. But it's okay to feel pretty down about it. Maggie, what role should companies play in terms of fostering an environment where employees feel supported during any type of difficult time?
I'm glad you say any type of difficult time, because we talk a lot at Forbes about the power of compassionate leadership, showing up for your team, really listening and understanding your colleagues. That's good for business results in normal times. It's good post-election. We have a lot of tips on the site. There are 3 that I like the most. Number 1, acknowledge the emotional toll that your employees might be experiencing. This does not mean taking a political stance, but it is saying that you recognize that some people might feel that their rights are threatened or that they have already lost rights and might be feeling especially anxious. Number 2, encourage flexibility. That's remote work, that's extended deadlines, that's extra PTO. Tell your team that you are open to them taking these things if they need them. And then finally, provide manager training so that the people managers, especially newer people managers, know how to show up and experience empathy, display empathy for their team members who are experiencing extra anxiety. It's ultimately about leading with your heart.
All right, Huma, really quickly, the role of social media. How do we balance being engaged but also protecting mental health?
The key word is to be balanced. And don't disengage entirely, because the fight has to continue. We know that. And so, as a woman said yesterday, she thought the fight began on election night, and then she cried on Thanksgiving because that was the time that she was allowed to give that emotional space. I think that's important. Find those spaces where we take care of ourselves, but stay focused on the fight.
Maggie McGrath and Huma Abedin, thank you both very much. And don't forget, nominations for the Forbes and Know Your Value 4th Annual 50 Over 50 Global List still open and due to high demand. We're extending the deadline to December 9th. If you know a woman living outside of the U.S. who is shattering age and gender norms, consider nominating her today. You can nominate yourself as well. You can get all the details at Forbes.com and KnowYourValue.com.